Hello everyone and welcome to episode number 60 of the PE Geek Podcast. And as always, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. Now, I often talk about time as being the ultimate commodity. It absolutely is. So that's why I really do appreciate you stopping by and listening to these episodes. If you're first time here, then you can go back through 60 episodes and piece out the things from those that you would like to introduce or explore in your PE classroom. And if you're a regular listener, thank you. If you haven't had a chance to leave a review yet, please do so. It does help other people find it. And if it's useful to you, it may be useful to other people. Now, today's episode is really close to my heart. It pretty much is what fuels this podcast in many ways. I fundamentally believe that technology has a massive role in education, and we're only seeing the really early % of its impact in the classroom. You would probably agree that technology at this stage, and I always talk about it as being only powerful when it's in the hands of the right person. So the fundamental belief here is that good teaching is absolutely what trumps any of the apps and tools and so on that we talk about. However, if you give a good teacher the good tools, then they can do a great job. So, this is where we're at now. But I sort of want to lay down the foundations and back it up with examples from people who know what they're talking about in the futurist perspective and talk about how technology is going to impact education. These are things that we're going to see eventuate in the next sort of 20 years. And as a result of them impacting education, and I mean disrupting education, not just impacting it, but fundamentally changing it for the better, then it's going to also flow down into physical education. So it's going to be an exciting episode, that's for sure. And it sort of traces right back to this whole idea that everything that's ever happened in society, no matter what, if you look at any advancement of the human species, and anything that's ever come out, I'm talking about cars and transport and medicines and whatever, they all come back to this idea of technology. So, assuming that education is not privy to this is outrageous. Technology has already impacted classrooms. You look back in history, and education has been impacted in numerous different ways, right from what tools people use to write with and then into digital technologies, which we're going to be diving into today because there's some massive change that we're about to see. We're pretty much at the bottom of that change curve. And for me, this is what gets me up. You can probably tell it in my voice. I love this stuff. And just being here at this particular point in time is extraordinary because we are going to see some absolute transformative changes in our society, and education is not immune to that. It's going to disrupt education for sure. Now, the reason I love technology so much basically is traced back to my days as a teenager. So I'd grown up being heavily obsessed with sport, track and field, and Australian rules football. But I was also interested in technology, and I would spend my own time learning how to program websites. And back in those days, you didn't have simple drag and drop tools. You had to learn HTML, and I thought that was a bit of a challenge, and I enjoyed it. And I would build things, and ironically, I would actually build websites about my favorite sports. It's interesting now that I have a website which is sort of on the same sort of path. But that's what I loved. I enjoyed this creation aspect. And, I thought that I just loved all technology. I thought that this was something that would translate into every possible area. So when I got my first ever Walkman, and you can imagine how amazing they were, I thought that I could take it apart and put it back together. And I thought that was because I was interested in all of technology. And rather than telling the whole story, I'll tell you the outcome, and that was it never went back together. I dismantled this Walkman and thought that I could get it back to working again, and quickly learned that it wasn't about, for me, the enjoyment here wasn't about the nuts and bolts of how things worked. It absolutely wasn't. I realized very quickly that I didn't really know how those things worked and how it brought to life music in this form. But what I actually loved was what it made possible. And for me, that Walkman it changed my life. And I mean that. It opened up this whole idea of you can have music and you can be walking with it. Like music was a big part of my life at that stage. And the fact that you could take songs and put them onto this thing and you could walk with it opened up my whole idea to just how amazing technology was. And once I realized that I wasn't necessarily interested in the nuts and bolts of how things work, but what it meant for humans and what it meant for me, then I absolutely was obsessed to trying to find how other things like technology could play a role for the future. So at this particular stage in my teaching, I look at everything from this perspective. I don't really care about what they do under the surface and the technology and the actual what it does. I care about the results that they get. And for me, I value any sort of technological tool if it hits a couple of important points. If it helps me with my teacher learning, so connecting with other teachers and finding new information, then I value it. Examples of that would be the social networks and a lot of the research tools and online search engines and so on. I think it's quite useful. The other area that I value technology these days in the classroom setting is if it improves my effectiveness or efficiency. And by that I mean if there was a way that I used to do something previously that didn't have technology and I introduce it and it makes it faster or more efficient so that I can focus on the thing that I do best, then I support it. And a big example of that would be TeamShake, the app. I mean, sure, it's just a bit of an app that creates teams, but because of the attention that you put into it, you can really sort of make those teams and so on best suited, and it brings the best of your teaching experience into an application such as that. So that's an example of the effectiveness scale. But the other thing that I really appreciate for technology at this stage is if it can help my students showcase their learning in a different way. So for example, rather than just explaining to me where they've gone and how they've improved and so on, if they can show it in the form of a video and have a voice over the top and help clearly communicate what they've done, then I start to value it. So if it hits any of these three areas, it improves my learning, if it helps me be more efficient and effective, or my students be more efficient and effective, or if it helps me showcase student learning or my students showcase student learning, then I value it. And we're only at the early days of this. This is really, really the 1% area of what we're going to see within the next 20 years. And you may be thinking, oh no, KJ, we hear this stuff all the time. It's, technology is coming around the corner. The next device is going to come out. It's going to transform this, that, and the other. And true, for many years you have heard this, and this is true. We do get these iterations of things that come out one year and they're a little bit better, and they come out the next year and this is the thing that's going to transform. And for the most part, all we see is incremental change. We see these tiny changes that again are really not that major in terms of their impact. But let me explain what's actually happening behind the scenes. So you may be familiar with this concept called Moore's Law. Now, Moore's Law is a law of computer science and so on, which has been prevalent since the 60s and the 70s, and it continues today. And basically, Moore's Law states that every so often, that's 2 years, computational power doubles and the price point of that technology minimizes. So what we're actually starting to see is better technology becomes more affordable, and it can therefore go to more people. So we're starting to see the early stages of real potential, and the smartphone was the biggest awakening to this actual reality. I mean, we had devices in our hands which were more capable than the computers which landed on the moon, the first ever spaceship that landed on the moon. So, Moore's Law is continuing into our current time, and it's going to continue at least for the next 30 years. And that means that things become more powerful and cheaper, and the net result is that in the smartphone example, everyone has smartphones. They can do things on them like connect to one another, and they've got access to the world's information all in the palm of their hand. And even with all of that playing field at our disposal, we are still in that early stage of the potential impact that a massive learning curve and growth curve has for us. Now, you might be saying at this point that, okay, we've got these devices, we've got iPads, we've got tablets and so on. What actual change has there been in schools? And you'd be right in saying that you cannot just throw a device into a classroom and all of a sudden it's transforming the way in which that person delivers. You need good teaching, and don't get me wrong, that's an absolute necessity. But this isn't necessarily going to be something that is as important as we move into the future. And there's so many examples of this sort of taking shape behind the scenes. And for the most part, everyone's ignoring it. Everyone's just going about their lives sort of in the same way that they were just going about their lives before smartphones appeared and going about their lives before the internet appeared. There's so many different behind the scenes that are happening right now, which are absolutely going to transform education. And if you don't believe it, then I just cannot wait to be on the right side of history when these things do. And the big part of this comes back to what Peter Diamandis refers to as the 3Ds. Now, Peter Diamandis is a visionary. He is an entrepreneur who is continually bringing about new industries and so forth, and in doing things that are absolutely out of this world, like mining asteroids, setting up X prizes to promote innovation in new areas. And he calls the 3Ds, the first thing that has to happen is things become digital. So something that wasn't digital before becomes digital. And for example, you could talk about, textbooks. Once upon a time, they were not digital, they were physical. And it meant that people all around the planet had to have high amounts of money to get access to that knowledge. And it meant that the third worlds missed out. All of a sudden, the next D is they become deceptive. And the example in the textbook space, again, would be textbooks appeared digital and they were only available in certain areas and they weren't quite great and hard to distribute to people. They were there, but they were deceptive. And then the final D in the equation is disruption. And that's when this deceptive sort of technology, which has been playing around for a while, becomes absolutely revolutionary. And if you look at the textbook example, the 3Ds have absolutely happened. The textbooks got digitized, they became deceptive, so they were available to a small handful of people, who really didn't understand the power. And as the Moore's Law continued, and you can see Moore's Law linking in here as well, textbooks became more easy to distribute, they become easier to get to people, and then eventually disruption occurs. And if you look back at all of the things in the internet and all the technology that's appeared, they all follow this 3Ds philosophy. The best example of this is Kodak and taking photos. And obviously photos play a space in phys ed. And if you think back to the early 1980s, if you took a photo, you had to get them then produced, and it was a nightmare of a thing. You had just a limited amount of photos on an exposure, and I can't even use the words properly because it's been so long and I've barely ever had that experience with them, but you had to get them developed. It wasn't great. But during that early stages, Kodak had the opportunity to purchase the sole rights to own digital photography. The people who had developed the algorithm that made it possible presented it to Kodak because obviously they were the leaders in this space. And Kodak said, no, this is definitely not going to be a thing. It's too poor. The resolution's not good enough. We're just going to continue making our prints. And we know that the people are going to continue making our prints. But this, the sad thing here in this story is that Moore's Law just kept doing its thing. More powerful, cheaper. And eventually digital cameras exploded. All of a sudden you've got cameras in your phone and photography became instant, cheap, accessible to everyone. And all of a sudden Kodak went bankrupt. So the 3Ds were in effect there as well. Now, what I'm going to say is that we're experiencing the 3Ds in education. So we've gone through this phase where teaching used to be face-to-face. It still is. For the most part, we're still delivering this face-to-face idea in classrooms, face to face, and eventually, we had this digitization of teaching. So you look at something like YouTube and Creative Live and lots of these spaces where you can communicate with people en masse digitally. And at the moment, I would say that for the most part, we're literally in this deceptive phase. So all of the apps and all of the devices that are coming out that are supporting classroom and teachers and making things possible and all the stuff I talk about in this podcast is actually in the deceptive phase. There's people using them. For the most part, it's still really dependent upon the person. But in the background, you can see the theme here. In the background, Moore's Law is making these things even more powerful, cheaper, more accessible, and everything's sort of coming together in this big convergence that's just going to shake up and disrupt education like we've never seen. So at this point you may be thinking, okay, well, what are the deceptive technologies which are happening in the background of our lives that we're sort of ignoring, that are going to make a bigger appearance in education circles over the coming years? And I'm going to go through all of them and sort of talk about the implications they have and why this is exciting for education, not necessarily something that you should be scared of or afraid of or feel threatened about. It's ultimately going to help us deliver on the core promise of education, which is to reach everyone and make sure that everyone has the opportunity to have a good education, which is something that as a world we really fail to be able to do. So the first lot of technologies sort of are very prevalent in our life at the moment, but they are the form of sensors. Now, sensors, I mean things like temperature reading devices, cameras are a sensor, microphones are sensors, etc. They're all sensors. Accelerometers, they're sensors. And we're reaching a stage now where the ability to get access to these sensors is so simple. You can install them in devices for relatively low cost, and we're going to see an explosion of sensors in pretty much everything over the coming years. So that there pretty much won't be anything that is not self-aware about itself, in the form of it being able to determine where it is in time and space, its temperature, how fast it's moving, etc. And pretty much all the things that we have in our lives will have sensors. Now, if you look at this trend across things that we own now, it's pretty clear that we've gone from having very little sensors in our lives onto heaps of them. You just think about your phone as the best example of it. But, now sensors are everywhere, and they're going to continue to appear everywhere, and they're going to become even easier to integrate into things that we have. So the example here that leads into phys ed is the ability to incorporate sensors into things such as our clothing. Now you might be thinking, why would you want to do that? Well, it's pretty powerful possibility when you start to be able to have the ability to track, say, heart rate just by wearing the shirt that you currently have on your back, perspiration, etc. And because of the fact that we know that there are indicators physiologically about the way someone acts when they're learning, and whether they understand certain dilation of pupils, etc. Like, these sort of cues happen during the learning process. And if we have enough sensors, and then they're discrete enough and they're powerful enough, we can start to use them to actually get objective data about understanding. And I think that's quite profound, because it then leads into, well, because of all this information that we're able to collect, we're able to be proactive with health opportunities as well. We're able to get data on things we couldn't have imagined before. And because of that, then we can start to really see the value of something like artificial intelligence. Now, for the most part, people laugh at this. When you look at Siri on your iPhone, it's pretty deceptive. It's there, it's a bit of a gimmick, it's not terribly powerful. But remember the 3Ds. In the background, these things are just becoming more and more powerful. And we're reaching a point where artificial intelligence will be able to utilize the enormous amount of information that's accessible to all of us via the internet, and be able to organize and sort through all the sensory information that it receives from the senses that we have. And as a result of that, be able to customize whatever's experience we're trying to provide with the AI to the person who is basically interacting with it. So think about that in an educational context. Peter Diamandis talks about, when we're talking to a student, there are very little cues as to sometimes them knowing whether they understand. We're teaching, and we tend to teach the same thing to all kids and at the same pace and at the same delivery and etc. But with something like artificial intelligence mapped to educational content, so let's say videos or other sort of material, and the AI is sitting over the top of that and interacting with that content, then it makes it really easy to deliver scalable and content and teaching in a way that is at the same pace as the student's progression and, in line with their own understanding. And he basically has pointed out the fact that, you could have the best teaching delivered to everyone across the globe in a platform such as, the internet with video, etc., and the artificial intelligence delivers it. Now, you may sit there and think, well, that's terrible. Teaching, that's what teachers do. My argument is that teachers don't do that very well anyway. We don't deliver information as good as other mechanisms. The thing that we do that cannot be replaced and will become more valuable and therefore make our jobs even better is the relationships. We will have more time to foster those relationships when we have tools such as artificial intelligence delivering true self-direct or true differentiation to students. So just think about it with that possibility. If we could take ourselves out of that problem that we have of trying to deliver content on scale to kids and differentiate it, we really can't do it that well. But with sensors and artificial intelligence, we will be able to do it well. Now, again, if you're sitting here in the Western world, it's such a challenge to think that maybe this is how classrooms will run in the future. And, that's right. It is a bit of a challenge and a bit of a change, but it has to happen. It absolutely has to happen. And the reason is that it's selfish to think that we can hold on to the classroom and be the person at the front of the room and teach this one way, because we're really not reaching the global majority of people in this method. And that is because the practices that we have now, where teachers train and then they go to universities and then they end up in classrooms, is so unscalable, it's frightening. And it just does not serve the vast billions of people who have not got good schools in their countries and who don't have access to the best teachers. But with tools such as artificial intelligence mapped with content made by the best teachers, we could actually do that. We could provide good quality education to people everywhere. And that's something that all teachers have an obligation to think about. You're not just teaching the kids in your room when they're there. I mean, think about it on a bigger scale than that. That's why artificial intelligence and distributed content through the internet excites me, because it will actually have the potential to impact everyone. And then the byproduct is it actually makes our job better, because we get to focus in on the thing that really matters, that we can't replace, and the thing we talk about all the time, which is relationships. So I see it as us still playing a really important role, a way more important role, sitting in the room with kids, creating these situations where they can interact and be social. But the teaching element of the knowledge transfer, whatever that may be, happens in a different means. Now, the next little exponential technology that is absolutely going to play a role in education, and we're starting to see it in these early days at the moment, is virtual reality. And you look at it and think, oh, come on, you're kidding me, Jared. But no, I'm not. I mean, virtual reality has been around for a long time. It was a gimmick, and as we're looking at those 3Ds again, it's been in the deceptive phase. It got digitized, and then it became deceptive, and most people ignored it because it was pretty junk. But now we're starting to see some really tremendously powerful things appear with virtual reality. And, what implications does it have for education? Well, at a certain point, our eyes above 4K. So if you know what a HD television is, it's 1080p, or 4K is 4000p, and the higher you go up, the clearer the image becomes. And at some point between 4K and 8K is the actual human eye. So we cannot distinguish beyond whether that's what we're looking at is real because of its clarity or whether it's actually a simulated image. So if you think about that we're very close to being able to produce images, or we can, but at 4 to 8K on all devices, for example, then if you have a virtual reality headset on, you're actually unable to tell the difference between a real and a simulated environment. Now, that might sound scary, but the opportunities for education are enormous. Rather than just sitting in a room learning about, a historical event, you could have a virtual reality headset on and you could be in the historical event, and it would look like you were actually there because the simulation is lifelike. There is no distinguished difference between you being there and it just being a simulation. And we're reaching that point at a very rapid pace. So what does that look like for phys ed? Well, a lot of the things that we do are preparation for situations that sometimes occur. We could make those situations occur all the time. We could simulate the opportunities that we want to prepare students to be able to solve and work within. So the ability to frame and create the classroom in an environment that then teaches them whatever we hope would be quite transformative. It would also, in other subject areas such as, people studying geography, etc., it's going to be out of control. The ability to put kids in a place and there's no distinguished difference to them actually being in that place or just being a simulation is going to be huge. And, you couple this with artificial intelligence and the sensors, and all of a sudden the AI is being able to manipulate the virtual reality display, and the sensors are reacting to things that it processes from your body. And you've got this convergence, which is the real trigger that is causing such a tremendous amount of opportunity in the world that we see coming along. But that's just 3 of the disruptive technologies. The other one is 3D printing. And I did a whole podcast episode on 3D printing and how it will impact phys ed back earlier on. You go through the list and you'll find it. But, 3D printing is democratizing a $10 trillion business or, venture that basically exists in the world. So what that means is that manufacturing, which is the $10 trillion entity, is being completely changed. You can now print objects and, they'll appear. And previously you would have had to have gone and purchased them and etc. So we're going to see tremendous opportunity here. 3D printing will reach the phys ed classroom in a way that means that you won't order your equipment from a supplier. You'll print your equipment and it's available on site, and it can be fully customized and it can suit whatever your needs are, which I think is tremendously powerful. And then if you look down at, things such as cloud computing, well, cloud computing is another digital disruptive technology that's mostly deceptive. We use it a lot these days. It's growing in popularity, but it's still early days. The idea that all the computing power sits in the cloud so that we've got access to be able to do all sorts of tremendously ridiculous processes and so on. But, you're still looking at a very small and simple device that can run, forever. But the processing is taking place in the cloud. So the opportunities there are going to be enormous. No longer will that mean that because you've only got access to a $100 laptop, you don't get to do X. Well, you will get to do X because the processing will be done off-site in cloud computing that's made available for everyone for free. And then if you think about, what are people doing to ensure that everyone gets internet access? Well, that's happening as well. Things like Project Loon by Google, who are literally floating balloons into the stratosphere, I think it is, and flying them over countries which have, for the most part, had governments that really have not provided internet to their people. But we're now seeing that by 2020, everyone on Earth will have access to a free 2 megabit per second connection, provided anywhere on Earth, completely circumvented by the government. So even if you were the government of that country, it's in the stratosphere, and it's being provided to their people. So we're seeing this tremendous bottom-up change, and it's not going to be a matter of whether you're connected, you'll have access to these things. Everyone will be connected, and everyone will have access to the cloud computing, the artificial intelligence, the videos, etc. And I think that's tremendously powerful. So this whole episode is a little bit of a journey on what's coming up. You're not going to escape this. I'm talking now from the fact that these are observed. These are things that we know are going to happen in terms of their trajectory, because we can map it based on Moore's law. It's not really fantasy. And the impact that they will have is going to be quite extreme, and it's going to challenge the way that we view the world and the way that we as teachers think our job, is. And that's a good thing. We need that. Every other industry on earth that's, being impacted by technology has had to rethink the way they work, and education should be no different. And the net goal here for me is that we need a world where everyone gets access to the best education, and there is no other way to make that happen than without leveraging these technologies that exist in the upcoming world, in our worlds now. And I think that's exciting. And the thing that really drove this home for me was my recent trip to Africa. And I got to spend some time with people who, for the most part, grew up in small villages in Kenya, really poor. And, the guy who was my tour guide told the story of, him going to school, and they didn't have any textbooks at all. And they just learnt from a chalkboard where the person, taught them a little bit of English, and that was it. They didn't have any books or anything. And he contrasts that to his 5 and 6 year old kids now who have learned English from YouTube clips, and are now onto learning mathematics from Khan Academy. And it's changed the game. They've seen how powerful this early technology that we have access to now is, and it's absolutely changing for the better the education of him and for many people in similar situations around the globe. And that is an indication of why the previous model and the model that we all use here in the Western society is completely broken and has elements in it that are really quite positive, but we don't really get to really leverage those because we spend time on all the broken parts. So I'm excited. You can probably tell I've spoken a lot longer than most episodes normally go for, but I think it's an important topic, and it's definitely going to be something that you see appear over the next 10 years, and all of those technologies that we've laughed at and thought were a little bit gimmicky, and like the ones I've mentioned in this last little bit, we're going to start to see come to fruition, and we're going to start to become and wonder how we ever lived without them. And ultimately, it's all about making the world a better place. And if we can do that, which I think is absolutely possible with the tools that are being laid out, then we're all going to be better off. So on that note, I'm going to leave it there. If you have any questions, get in touch with me on Twitter, social networks, Anchor, Facebook, wherever you happen to go. You'll probably be able to find me, or send me an email at jared@thepegeek.com, or visit this page and get all the resources and links mentioned at thepegeek.com/60, as in for episode 60. Speak soon, and thanks for listening.